There's something deeply wrong when the dead don't stay buried. Imagine walking into your child's bedroom only to realize the doll sitting at the desk isn't a doll at all. It's a real body, preserved, dressed, decorated, loved. In Russia, a man named Anatoly Moskvin lived for years among 26 exhumed girls, each stolen from the grave, each treated like a child he never had. He didn't kill them, he rescued them, or so he claimed. But why did he do it? And how did no one notice, not even his parents living under the same roof? Let's start digging. I first read about Anatoly Moskvin in an old news article that barely scratched the surface. Just a headline, really, historian arrested for living with 26 corpses. At first, I thought it was fake, clickbait, urban legend. But the deeper I looked, the more disturbing the truth became. He lived in Nizhny Novgorod, a peaceful Russian city not far from Moscow. People knew him as a brilliant man. He spoke more than 10 languages. He wrote articles about cemeteries and ancient history. He wasn't some outsider. He was respected, even liked, but he was always odd, quiet, always seen alone. And here's what's really unsettling: he didn't live in isolation. He lived with his parents in a modest apartment, a small home that held a big secret. But we'll get there. Let me ask you something. If someone you knew was always visiting cemeteries, would you ask why? Anatoly had an obsession, not with murder, not even with death, but with what comes after. He called himself a necropolis expert. He spent his days walking through graveyards, documenting headstones, studying burial customs, and even sleeping on graves. At one point, he claimed he had visited over 700 cemeteries. He said he felt a connection with the dead. He called them his little girls. Sometimes he left notes at their graves. Other times, he took them home. Yes, home. How? That part is shocking. But here's what's even worse: he believed he was helping them. He believed they were lonely, forgotten, and he had a way to keep them alive in his own twisted mind. Viewers, let me ask you, do you think obsession alone explains what he did next? The police weren't looking for bodies when they showed up at Anatoly's apartment in 2011. They were investigating a string of grave robberies, small ones, nothing violent, just disturbed plots and missing remains. Then, inside that cramped flat, they opened a door. There, sitting on the bed, was what looked like a large handmade doll, wearing a bright dress, blonde hair, ribbons, shoes, painted face. But something was off, too real. It wasn't long before they realized the truth: these weren't dolls, they were corpses. One by one, police discovered 26 preserved bodies of young girls. Some were as young as 3. All of them had been dug up, brought back, and kept like family. And here's the part that still gives me chills: his parents were home, living there, cooking, cleaning. They said they thought the dolls were just his strange collection. But 26? Why didn't they look closer? Why didn't anyone? When police questioned Anatoly, he didn't run. He didn't deny it. In fact, he seemed proud. He calmly explained that he had carefully chosen each girl based on how they spoke to him through their headstones. He believed he had a spiritual connection with them. In his mind, they were not dead. They were just asleep, and he was keeping them safe until science could bring them back. Let that sink in. He washed their bodies, wrapped them, dressed them in new clothes, applied makeup. Some had music boxes stitched inside them. Others had buttons for eyes. And every year he celebrated their birthdays with cake. Do you think he was insane? Or do you think he knew what he was doing and just didn't care? One of the biggest mysteries is how Anatoly Moskvin's parents had no idea what was happening under their own roof. But Anatoly was secretive. He had his own locked room. He told them the dolls were a creative project, that they were life-sized figures for a museum display, and they believed him. For nearly a decade, his mother would walk past those rooms without questioning the smell, the odd noises, the locked doors. His father once asked why he needed so many. Anatoly answered, "They're my children." And still nothing was done. So here's the question: was it ignorance, denial, or did they suspect something and choose to stay silent? Once the remains were carefully examined, the truth became even darker. Each of the 26 girls had been taken from a grave. Some were fresh, others had been buried for years. He used a mix of chemicals and methods to preserve them: linen, salt, baking soda, plastic. He stuffed their insides with rags and old toys to keep their shape, wrapped their hands in cloth, painted over their faces with nail polish to make them pretty. It wasn't random. He had a system, a ritual. But why girls? Why only girls? Anatoly later told investigators that he had tried to adopt, that he longed for a daughter but was denied by the state. He turned to the only place he could find one: the cemetery. And that leads to an even harder question: could this tragedy have been prevented? Each girl Anatoly took had a name, a real life, a real family. He kept detailed journals listing the graves he visited, what drew him to each girl, and what messages he believed they sent him. Yes, messages. He claimed they spoke to him through dreams, through whispers in the cemetery. He said they asked to be saved, to be brought home. Authorities cross-checked his journals and grave records. The names matched, the ages, the plots. Some of these girls had been missing for decades, not from life, but from death. Their families never knew their graves had been disturbed. Can you imagine that? Visiting your child's grave and never realizing she wasn't there. Once the story hit the news, everything exploded. Families across Nizhny Novgorod were contacted. Police had to deliver the worst kind of second heartbreak, telling parents that their daughters had been taken from their final resting place, that a man had been living with their corpses. Some parents were crushed, others furious. Many couldn't even speak. One mother said, "It's like losing her all over again." Another asked, how could no one stop him? He wrote about graves all the time. He bragged about them. And they were right. Anatoly had published articles for years, essays, poems, even a strange manifesto about immortality and childhood. All of it was public, but no one connected the dots until it was too late. Let's go back to the moment it all unraveled. In 2011, Anatoly was being watched as part of a larger grave desecration investigation. Police had already noticed a pattern: girls missing from cemeteries, strange symbols at graves, notes left behind in different languages. They followed him, watched him, and then one day they got a warrant to search his apartment. What they found inside would haunt the country. Not just the bodies, but the way he kept them lined up like a macabre family. Teacups in front of them, stuffed animals, schoolbooks. One even had a TV remote placed in her hands. Anatoly looked at the officers calmly and asked them to please not hurt his girls. Let that sink in. He wasn't hiding them. He thought he was protecting them. Once Anatoly Moskvin was arrested, psychologists stepped in to evaluate him. What they found was deeply unsettling, but not simple. He was highly intelligent, not confused, not lost in madness. He could explain everything he did, step by step. He never once claimed it was wrong. In his mind, this was an act of mercy. He believed the girls were trapped between life and death, and he was the only one willing to save them. He told doctors, "I didn't dig them up, I brought them back." He had studied ancient cultures that practiced mummification. He believed in a future where death could be reversed, and he was preparing the girls for that day. It wasn't murder, it wasn't violence, but it was still horror. A quiet horror born from obsession and complete disconnection from reality. So now the question was, what do you do with someone like this? When Anatoly appeared in court, the public reaction was explosive. Some saw a sick man, others saw evil. Parents of the stolen girls demanded justice. But there was one problem. Anatoly had never physically hurt anyone. He hadn't killed, he hadn't attacked, and he wasn't selling the remains or doing it for money. What he did was horrifying, but was it criminal in the usual sense? Psychiatrists ruled that he suffered from a severe mental disorder, specifically paranoid schizophrenia. He was declared unfit to stand trial. Instead of prison, Anatoly was sent to a psychiatric hospital indefinitely. No sentence, no end date, just treatment, evaluation, and silence. But this only raised more questions. Will he ever be released? What if he still believes the girls are alive? And what about the parents? Did they get justice? Since being committed, Anatoly Moskvin has lived behind the walls of a secure psychiatric facility. But he's not forgotten. Every few years, Russian media revisits the case. Whispers spread, some say he might be released, others say he's worse than ever. In 2018, reports surfaced that doctors believed he was improving and could be eligible for outpatient care. The public was outraged. One father said, "He played house with my daughter's corpse. That's not something you recover from." As of now, Anatoly remains in treatment, but the law gives no clear answer on how long he'll stay there. Will he walk free someday? And if he does, will he go straight back to the graves? After the initial shock wore off, authorities faced another chilling question: were there more? Anatoly kept maps, journals, diaries filled with grave locations, strange symbols, names written in dozens of languages. Some were marked visited. Others had stars next to them. A few were circled. But not all the names matched known cemetery records. Investigators feared he might have disturbed many more graves than the 26 confirmed ones. Perhaps dozens more, maybe even beyond Nizhny Novgorod. But without bodies missing, without fresh clues, how would they know? Even today, some families fear their child might have been part of his obsession and they just haven't been told yet. Could the number be higher than 26? Could he have taken others and hidden them somewhere else? What happened to the apartment where all of this took place? Believe it or not, it still stands, in a quiet residential block surrounded by ordinary neighbors. After his arrest, the police removed the bodies, but much of the room was left untouched for months. Some neighbors reported strange smells for years. Others said they had no idea what was going on. One woman who lived on the same floor told reporters, "He was polite, a little strange maybe, but no one thought he was dangerous." That word again, strange, so often ignored, so often dismissed. Today, the apartment has changed hands, but online it's still talked about. Some even claim it's haunted. Others say it's cursed ground. And the real question is how many people walked through that home, looked those dolls in the face, and said nothing. Anatoly Moskvin left behind more than corpses. He left behind a question that has no easy answer. Was this man a criminal, a madman, a victim of mental illness? Or was he something worse, someone who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway? His story forced a country to look at how it treats mental health, how it safeguards the dead, how it listens or fails to listen to the signs of obsession turning into something darker. And even now, over a decade later, the case still haunts Russia. It's taught in universities, studied by criminal psychologists, used as an example of what happens when intelligence, loneliness, and obsession twist into something unspeakable. But maybe the most chilling part. He didn't need to kill anyone to become one of the most disturbing criminals in modern history. Among Anatoly's belongings, police found dozens of handwritten letters addressed to the girls. Some were birthday notes, some read like bedtime stories, others were full of apologies, promises. He begged them to forgive him, promised to keep them warm, said he'd never let them feel alone again. One letter read, I hear you in my dreams. You are not gone. You are just sleeping, and I will be here when you wake. He truly believed he was caring for them, that these weren't bodies, they were children waiting to come back to life. And maybe that's the scariest part. He didn't see it as wrong, he saw it as love. But tell me, can love exist without consent, without reality? Investigators recreated the layout of his apartment to try to understand how he lived like this. The dolls were kept in separate rooms. Each had their own little space. Some were placed on couches, others had small beds. One had a school bag next to her. A few even had musical toys that still played when touched. And the silence was overwhelming. No one knows how he managed to live that way, day in, day out, surrounded by bodies, never breaking the illusion. Or maybe he did break just silently, quietly, while still believing he was right. The flat was later cleared, but those rooms will never really be empty. Because once something like that happens there, it never truly leaves. There's one theory investigators quietly shared, one they've never been able to prove, that Anatoly wanted to be caught. Think about it. For years, he wrote about graves, about death, about rituals. He shared his theories publicly. His ideas were strange but open, almost like bait. Did he think someone would stop him? Or was he testing the limits of what society would accept? After all, he didn't hide the dolls. He dressed them up, positioned them, made them visible, celebrated their birthdays out loud. It wasn't just obsession, it was performance. And maybe, just maybe, it was a cry for someone to finally see what was really going on. Today, Anatoly Moskvin remains locked away. No one knows if he'll ever be released. Doctors give careful, quiet updates, but nothing is final. The families have tried to move on. Some held second funerals. Some never visited the graves again. There were calls for new laws to protect burial sites, but the wound was already deep. And that pain, the feeling that your child was disturbed, stolen, used in someone's delusion, that pain never fully fades. They didn't just lose their daughters once, they lost them twice. As Anatoly was being led out of his apartment in handcuffs, surrounded by the bodies of 26 stolen girls, he looked at the officers calmly and said one sentence: "You abandoned them. I brought them home." Even now, no one really knows what to make of that. Was it delusion, manipulation, or did he truly believe he was doing something kind? One thing's for sure, the girls never asked to be saved. They never asked to be remembered like this. And Anatoly Moskvin will go down in history not for what he destroyed, but for what he thought he was restoring.